What's up, guys?
It's Rowan
and Terry
from ArtofSmartTV, and we're bringing you another episode of
HSC Economics Review.
Awesome. Now, in this episode, I'm super pumped because that 2019 HSC paper has been officially released, and we're going to be unpacking two things. Number one, we're going to be looking at how we went with our predictions, right? Actually, we're going to hold ourselves accountable, funny enough, to the predictions we made and what did the paper look like and how did we go. More importantly as well though, what we're going to dive in is we're going to look at the tricky parts of the paper. Now, I don't think any of the paper was necessarily super challenging, but as usual, there's little tricks that they put in here to make it more challenging and to trip you up. And so we're going to unpack what they are and how you can avoid them. And in doing so, we're also going to discuss some of the trends as a result that we're seeing sort of flow through in the paper so you can be mindful in your preparation if you're sitting the HSC in 2020. So, diving in, Terry, how did we go with some of our predictions?
All right, well, obviously we didn't have the same predictions, but they were very, very similar. So let's start with the short answers.
Cool.
Okay. Me personally, I had the exchange rates and balance of payments, and that was a short answer that popped up. Spot on. I had the environment as well. So I went 2 for 4. The ones that I didn't quite hit though were the economic growth and development one, which was linked to the case study, which kind of threw me off. I didn't really expect to see the case study in the paper at all, really. And then of course the monetary policy, I did expect to see that more on the essay side. But Rowan, how did you do? So I went 2 for 4. What about you?
Yeah, so I equally had environment, which was great. We both were big proponents of environment into this. I equally got thrown with monetary. I did think it would be actually in the essays. So I didn't get monetary. Didn't get economic growth and development. I did have globalization and maybe categories of dev, but it was different. So I'm not gonna call that one.
Because they did focus quite strongly on dev for like 8 or 9 of the marks.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So it's like, okay, like in the ballpark, but not close enough to call it, right? And then I did have the balance of payments is one of them. So I didn't explicitly link it to exchange rates. It was more just like a balance of payments. So maybe 1.5. Right. I got pretty close with that one. So close. But I think still either way, I know that we had a bunch of comments come through where students had said, you saved me, I wouldn't have studied environment if I hadn't watched your predictions. So I'm glad we were able to help some students out by making sure the environment happened, right? So now, what about essays? How did you go with the essays, Terry?
Not so good. Really, I only really hit the micro policy one, and that was just kind of in general micro policy linked with the employment. In the actual HSC, I think they threw in inflation as well as employment with the micro. But other than that, it was looking pretty dire.
And we can unpack this in a moment because this highlights the trends that we're really seeing in the paper, and it was why in the prediction video we talked about the challenge of the predictions, right? That increasingly NESA is trying to really, it's been the same syllabus for so many years now that the only thing they can start to do is start to jam different things together, and as a result it does make it a little more complex to work out, well, what on earth are they going to pair? So I did a little bit better in the essays than I did in the shorts, actually, right? So, in the essays, I'd picked a global economy with a free trade protection, which was one of the questions that came through, which was great. And then I'd also identified unemployment with micro. Now, I didn't get the little inflation pull in there, but the core of the question was an unemployment micro question. So, 2 out of the 4 essays, which I'm super stoked about.
Because if you pick those 2, you would have had the 2 essays, like in the 2 section 3 and 4.
That's right, which was awesome, right? Yeah. So if you watched our predictions, you pretty much would have been, between the pair of us actually, right? Good for 2 out of the 4 short answers and 2 out of the 4 essays, half the paper. And I believe overall we got 5 out of the 8 topics as well, which is pretty awesome. So, I was a little nervous, being honest, right, about the predictions just because we did say a couple of them were a little out there. We weren't really sure. And the irony is the ones that we were a little more out there on were actually the ones that were in the paper, right? So the risks paid off, which was awesome to see. Now, I think what I want to do just with the essays is just a quick moment to dive in to talk about the trends, right? Because I think the essays do show the changing nature of, the HSC Economics paper, essentially. Right, so if we look at question 25, it was discuss the effects of sustained budget deficits. So straight away, we're a little more specific than what you would typically get in the past, which might be just a broader like budget question, right? Or even broader than that, a macro question, right? On economic growth and external stability. So, they've combined two that aren't often combined, right? Like it's not to say that it's uncommon to combine them, because clearly external stability is going to be a constraint, and concerns about external stability can be a constraint on economic growth. But I think clearly they've gone more specific here, right, with budget deficits, which I think would have thrown students a little.
I think, at the same time, I think the fact that they've included sustained budget deficit, that's really going to show up on those marking criteria, and they're really picking just very specific qualifiers in their essay questions now.
And these are straight out of the syllabus, right? Size and composition. Then these like words exactly lifted from the syllabus, right? So I think one, they're doing that. Two, though, to answer a question on sustained budget deficits, you actually need to know more than just this last year's budget. So it's also creating greater emphasis and understanding, honestly, like the last 10 years, what's been happening, what are the trends, which I think makes it harder for students to really show. Now, they've been helpful, of course. They provided some data, that it's a stimulus question, but in saying that, it still required you to have, I think, a broader sense to draw some comparisons. So that's example number one, okay? We see, question number 26, the effects of micro on employment and inflation, right? So once again, typically, micro might be linked to employment as part of like a labour market, okay? It might be linked to distribution of income and wealth, maybe. It's not often linked to inflation, although there is a clear relationship in terms of micro increasing aggregate supply, reducing inflationary pressure in the economy. So you can see why they're doing it, but certainly it's, again, not something that's typically being combined. So it's another example of, interesting combinations that we need to look for moving into HSC 2020. Now, the other two essays we have in the paper, we've got, explain the causes and effects of unequal distribution. I mean, that's a more standard question, honestly. And then explain the effects of protectionist policies on the Australian global economy. That's also a little more common. So it looks like what they've done is they've really mixed things up a little, for, section 3. And section 4, they've gone back to, sort of some more straightforward questions, shall we say.
Just to add on to that, actually, I think because section 3 gives them an opportunity to provide stimulus, I think that's kind of their invitation that they're using to actually beef up the questions a little bit, because they're allowed to give you data, and I think they actually gave you 3 pieces of data, which I think sometimes they've just often went to 2.
Yeah, it's often 2, that's right.
So it really, if we are going to follow this trend along, potentially next year, it could also be a much beefier question 25 and 26.
That's right.
With a lot of just emphasis on using data, really.
And so the good thing is, they'll help you a little, right? I mean, because my feeling was the data they gave this year was actually probably more useful
than usual.
Because sometimes you get data and you look at it and you're like, really? Like, you chose this out of all the possible stuff you could have, where honestly looking at the data here, it was like, okay, it made more sense. Like, I could see how you could use it, and particularly because of the time frames they gave it across as well, right? It linked to the questions a little bit more. So I think you're right, Terry, it's a great point. They're going to help you a little bit more with the data, but it still shouldn't, I think, mean that you get lazy and go, well, I'm not going to spend the time understanding the trends in more detail.
If anything, they're going to help you, but they're also going to expect more from you. That's what I think that's going to happen.
Definitely. So now let's dive in and look at some of the, we're going to particularly look at some of the, from speaking with students, there's questions that we know were, as I said, not necessarily challenging, but tricky, right? So we're going to just dive in and have a look at some of these across the multis and the short answers, and just unpack maybe how to think about it or what to look out for, but also what it says for trends as well in future questions. So, question 4 was not a complex one, but I know students got a little tricked by it. Okay, what was the question, Terry, and where did students struggle?
Which policy in Australia is least likely to be influenced by political constraints? Well, one thing which they might have been tripped up on is just the reading of the question, because I think a lot of times students will just see political constraints, let's go fix it.
And so they don't actually read least, which is the critical thing in there, right? And I think that's where I saw students make mistakes. Definitely, because it's also question 4 in, right? And I know most students, you're trying to rip through your multis in as quick time as possible, so you can maximise, and because it's so early in, those sorts of things get, So in this case, right, what we're really looking at is like the least likely to be influenced is really what? right? We're going with monetary,
Yeah.
right? Because it's an independent, it's independent from the political process, right? So it's, I think, a fairly obvious answer, but it's just, again, reading the question, right? So I think really critically, whenever you see like likely questions, like the wording likely, get in and read that again, underline the key stuff. Honestly, it trips so many people up. Cool.
Yeah.
So next question, right? What was the next question students struggled with?
Number 5, which of the following is most likely to be the cause of a rise in the participation rate? So Rowan, I think you had more students telling you about this one. What was the problem?
Yeah, so I think the main thing here is that obviously, a rise in the participation rate is generally when you've got more people, in the labour force, right? So you've got more people unemployed or employed, right, over the total working age population. Now, honestly, most people I think got this right, but what threw them was, this idea of option C here said more unemployed people are joining the Defence Force. And it was just something they'd never seen before. They weren't sure of the relationship the Defence Force had with the labour force more generally. And so it was just like, I don't know what that is, maybe that's right. And it was more a self-doubt, actually, right? Because if you know how the labour force works, you would know, well, okay, B, very much accurate, right? More parents are returning to the workforce, that makes sense. But if there was a little bit of doubt here, I saw some students get swayed just because they thought, I don't know what this is and maybe it's right.
Yeah, happens often.
And it's not a good approach. So in other words, don't just go with that. If you see an answer and you don't know it, don't necessarily think that's right. Okay. Often what I find with multi is your first gut feel is often right for questions that you start second guessing. I find students often will complain and they'll be hitting themselves in the head like, I had that right and then I changed it. Okay. So that's question 5. What's the next one that students struggled with a little bit? Yeah, like I saw 8. Again, not challenging. What's the question?
Which pair of sectors contribute most to Australia's export income? And I think this is interesting because I think they have tried to ask a little bit more topical stuff, right? Things which do require a little bit more than just reading the textbook cover to cover and actually just kind of digesting some data. And so I think for a lot of students, they picked mining and agriculture because they just thought, hey, Australia, commodities, let's go with commodities. But obviously you should have picked...
Well, hopefully maybe it wasn't obvious for some, right?
I should say that. But yeah, hopefully you did pick A, mining and services.
That's right. And I think the interesting thing is it also reflects, I think, an understanding of the composition and the changing composition of Australia's trade.
Which is part of the
course, right? Yeah, and I think it highlights, it's topic 1. It's often a topic, honestly, that I find that students, as you move through the course, tends to get neglected again because topics 3 and 4 are more challenging. They're in some ways a little more interesting. They're more topical with what's going on, and you sort of forget and neglect this idea, particularly because it's jammed in as part of even sometimes, it is topic 2, like current account, right? Changing composition, right? So I think the key here is that agriculture used to be, but really, it hasn't been for quite some time. And really services for quite a long period of time. And the clue to that is really like the Dutch disease during the mining boom. Like, why talk about the fact that the high dollar was hurting service industry? Well, we talk about it because mining was our number 1 industry and services was our number 2, and it was having opposing effects on our 2 major export industries. So, great, A was the correct answer there. Okay, great. The next one that we saw students have challenges with was, I think, question 12.
Yeah.
Now, what confused students here?
Well, I think they just don't get enough practice calculating net foreign liabilities to begin with, and then calculating it as a percentage of GDP. Because I think for this section, I think students again it just seems to be something with the external stability. They seem to want to rush it, and they want to get towards the the current account deficit and understanding all the cyclical and structural factors. But there's also just these calculations that you've got to make, right? Measures of external stability to begin with.
And I think you've hit it right on the head. Like, I think what we're seeing here in this paper is that, necessarily trying to test things that are in the course, but in different ways.
Yeah.
So, you're expected to know here that net foreign liabilities is net foreign debt plus equity. Okay? That's the formula that you learn, but it is very rare that you will be given a question, typically as part of skills, that actually gets you to calculate it, which is why I think you're right on. Lack of experience calculating. But if you know the core sort of theory, right, we know that, well, if net foreign liabilities is debt plus equity, we add the 2 of them together and then we put them over the GDP figure to work out the actual correct answer here. Now, I can't remember the correct answer because I haven't done it, but really quickly, that's going to be what, 900 plus 100. So we get
1,000.
1,000 billion over 1,800 billion, whatever that works out to be.
Should be D.
D, okay, great. I don't have my calculator with me.
Should be D.
Great, Terry's the calculator, fantastic. Great, the answer is D. So then, what's the next question that students struggled with?
Oh, 13 and 14 just knocked them out.
13 and 14, just
So 12,
dominoes,
13,
right?
14.
One after the other.
That's the worst feeling, right? You just
Yeah.
3 in a row that you're not sure of. 13 has been done before, I think.
It has.
Was quite recent as well. I think it was either 2015 or 16. So it must have been something which they felt they needed to test again. It still gets students, actually, probably shouldn't say this, but it still gets a lot of teachers. I've seen this question, probably answered it about 4 or 5 times for teachers. But it's a really interesting one. All it goes is inflation in a hypothetical economy has decreased from 3% in year 1 to 2% in year 2. Based on this information, which statement is true?
And so I think the real trick here, right, is we're so ingrained to think, well, inflation means prices going up, right? So inflation's 3 in year 1, it's 2 in year 2, therefore we must say that, well, like, prices are going up, right? And of course the trick here is to realise, well, you know, like, well, at the same time, actually, I should say, I actually got it right. I'm glad I failed the trick, right?
He's so good. He's too good.
I think certainly if I could reframe that the trick is that we look at the rate being 2% in year 2 and go, well, inflation, you know, like prices are going down, essentially, okay? Where not the case. Inflation is still happening. It's still prices are still growing at 2% in year 2. So in terms of what that means, right, what that helps, it really knocks a lot of the answers out really quickly here, doesn't it? Once you appreciate that. So what ends up being the correct answer here, Terry?
Well, C and D actually aren't all that relevant.
That's right,
Because you need to know what the unemployment is in that case. And the inflation could be anything really, based on that Phillips curve. But I'm guessing a lot of people would have went with A. Because I think also...
Again, you've done the same thing as me, right? Great, look at that. On top of it.
Oh my
God. Fantastic.
A lot of people would have went with B because they believe that a lower inflation rate means prices are going down, but no, it just means that they're actually just increasing, but at a slower rate. Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, B with prices are decreasing on average, wrong.
Yeah.
A is prices are increasing on average, which is the correct answer there.
Yeah. The good news is we would have got that one right.
Yeah, that's right. Tricking ourselves now. So then 14, right? 14 was an interesting one. Because I think 14 again shows the trend that we're seeing in this paper, and how do we take stuff that's pretty well worn, right? Like unemployment calculations, like, you know, whenever you get them, it's always in the same style and frame. They've thrown it in here, but it's actually quite a novel presentation, right? Because instead of, you know, giving you things that they've basically said here, guys, on question 14, they've given you working age pop, full-time employed, participation rate, unemployment rate. And then they've said how many people are employed part-time in the economy. So you haven't got that data, and you've got to use the data above to actually work it out, right? Which is pretty cool. So, I mean, how should students think about doing that?
Well, the first thing is just take a close look at what you've been given, right? And then if you're really not sure, maybe just write down the formulas that you do remember.
Because I think that's so critical.
Because as Rowan was saying, like, they're not going to test you on things which they haven't taught you. They literally are not allowed to. And if they do, well, please let us know, and we'll file a complaint.
And I think they'll certainly present it in a way to make you think that you might not have been taught it, right?
Yeah. They want you to doubt yourself a little bit, as evil as it sounds. But yeah, so for this one, you know, you write down that the working age population is 10 million, full-time employed is 4 million. The participation rate is 50%, which implies that your labour force is going to be 5 million.
That's right. So it's 50% on the 10 mil?
Of the 10 mil, yeah. And then you work backwards and you go, well, if I've got a full-time employed of 4 million, I've got unemployed of 10%.
And that's the key, because I think that's just a mistake that students made. I think students got to the point where they, in some cases, right, could actually go, well, I know that 5 million is my working, you know, like my labour force, right? Well, if full-time's 4, I know, therefore, you know, like, well, maybe part-time is 1 million, right? And they put the answer as 1 million B.
Because it is one of the answers, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they've done that purposefully, right? To trick you. The issue is that, yes, that doesn't take into consideration the unemployment rate, which is why they've given you an unemployment rate. So what do we do then with that unemployment rate?
Well, then we realise that the unemployment rate of 10% is 10% actually of the labour force. So if we work
That's
out
right.
earlier,
Not on the working age
Yeah.
population, which
Yeah.
is the other mistake we saw students make.
so then so if we work out that the labour force was 5 million, 10% of 5 million is 500,000. So we add it all up. We've got full-time of 4 million, unemployed of 5 million. 500,000, and so therefore the remainder must be the part-time employed in this case, which is the 500,000,
which means we've got A as the correct answer, which is awesome. So then the next question we saw was question 18. That also, it was a little tricky for students, right? And again, we've got another 3 in a row here that we're about to come into, right? That are just going to knock students down. Great way to finish the multis. So, what's this question about? We've got, combination of factors is most likely to result in an increase in the TWI. Where do students go wrong with this, Terry?
Well, I think the terms of trade bit wasn't too big of a problem, right? Because the students could recognise that if the terms of trade increases or improves in the short run, you are going to be selling more dollars worth of exports, and therefore that's going to lead to an increase in your TWI. But what I think tripped students up for me was just they didn't read the question, right? Because they're so ingrained with looking at Australia's interest rates relative to the global interest rates, right? But this time they've actually flipped it, right? And so, if you just go in there, you're like, yep, increase, and then you go with A, and that's actually not the correct answer.
That's right. And so, because the key here is if global rates relative to Australian rates, increase, okay, it actually means they're more attractive now. So we're going to see actually falling a value of the Australian dollar, and therefore a falling TWI, okay? So it's why actually we need global interest rates to decrease relative to Australia. We get a positive differential, or at least a more positive differential. And therefore we get increasing value of the dollar. So that means the answer was B, increase in terms of trade and decrease in global interest rates. Now we get to the final sort of 3 multis here, which I know did a lot of heads in. Final 2 multis, I should say. 19 and 20. And again, it wasn't because they were necessary. Again, it was things that had been taught. It's again just a slightly different presentation of it. Particularly, I think, with question 20. I think question 19 a little bit less so, okay? I think that's a more standard one, and I find that more students got 19 right. But certainly a lot still got 20 wrong. So what's 19 about? We'll start there.
Okay, so I think it's been going on for the past 3 years, but 19 and 20 for like the past 3 years have all been tariff questions.
Yeah, okay.
So it's very interesting, right?
So do your tariff practice, clearly, right? And not just tariff, like, clearly here they've mixed it in, right?
And they did that last. They did that last year as well.
And I think a lot of students tend to be quite strong on tariff because it's probably the simplest one to understand. It's a tax, right? You see a price change, it's simple, right? Quotas start getting a little more challenging. They're still okay, but they're a little more challenging. And then it's like subsidies screw students over, and that's exactly what we've seen here. So what are they doing in 19?
Okay, so they said that they've got a world price of $3. They're considering imposing a tariff that would have the same impact on domestic production as an import quota of 20,000 items. What is the total tariff revenue that will generate? And when you read that, you're like, what? You're like, what? There's just so many moving parts there, right? So what would you have done just to get it started?
Yeah, well, I think that the big thing to realise is that tariff, is a tax and price, quota is quantity, but ultimately they often have very similar impacts, right? So I think that's why they've connected them here. So my first thought is, well, 20,000 items, that means that we've only got imports to 20,000. So I look at the diagram and go, well, it means that that's going to be between 30 and 50,000. Okay, that's what we're going to see. Because if it, the moment we've got to realise that world price is at 3, so imports right now are actually between 60 and 20,000, so they're 40,000, exactly. So we're going to see that. So if we then draw new lines at 30 and 50 quantity to get to that new 20,000, what it takes us up to is it takes us up to a price point of 4, okay, in this market, okay, which would therefore then be the point at which we would need the new world price plus quota, right, or the tariff, right, or the protection, I should say, world price plus protection. Right, and so therefore if it's a tariff, yes, in this case, right, to get to that same effect, we're clearly showing that there's a dollar tariff here, but we've actually got to work out revenue. Okay, so it's $1 times 20,000, which gives us the answer of C, $20,000 in total tariff revenue generated. Now, that's 19, okay, so I think that was just needing to think a little laterally, right, in terms of understanding the quota component. We now then get, and they've done really kudos, Nessa, if you're watching this, kudos
probably
to
are.
getting like the three of the, like the quota, the tariff, and the subsidy in 2 questions related. Like, great job. Just want to call that out. So 20, what's 20 about?
Okay, so the important thing to realize was that 20 actually is kind of detached from 19. It's almost like a new question. It's just using the same situation.
That's
Well,
right.
$3.
And I think that actually sort of screws people
Yeah.
over a little bit
Yeah,
because they're quite grounded in the prior question without being able to step out and look at what's given on the question singularly. So sorry, what happens?
Yeah, so assume that the government decides to only use subsidies as a form of protection. What is the subsidy per unit that would result in no imports?
Cool. And I think this is just really like screwed a lot of people over, didn't it? They're like, no imports? Like, how do we even get here? How much does a subsidy work? And so I think, what's the first thing students need to do? Like, what's the main, like, I think there's one thing that if you get this one thing right understanding-wise for this question, the question sort of flows for you.
Okay, well, I think you've got to understand how you actually get no imports.
Exactly, right?
Like,
If you don't understand that, you're
like
screwed.
the concept has to revolve around, like, you've got to understand that in order to get no imports, you've essentially got to, if you just remember that with a subsidy, you are essentially going to be shifting your supply curve to the right because you're helping them produce more at a lower price.
That's right.
You essentially need to shift it to the amount where your supply can then meet, your local supply can meet your local demand. And that is the case with no imports. It doesn't
And that's
matter
at the world price.
Yeah.
Right? Because obviously equilibrium, above world price
It's
is
not gonna matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you need to move it essentially, supply where it is now, to form a new equilibrium at world price, basically. In this case, it's $3, right? So we've got to look at, well, at $3 in the diagram above, the demand is at, 60,000 units, right? So we've got to somehow get that supply curve from the equilibrium it is currently at to form an equilibrium at the point, where we've got the $3 intersecting with the 60,000 units of supply. So once we get that there, then the rest of this question sort of starts to flow, right? Because once we have a line there, how do we then work out the subsidy? Because I know a lot of students then will they might have got that right, but then they make the second mistake here, which is they then miscalculate the size of the subsidy, right? So how do we do that?
Well, yeah, because it almost feels like you're just doing, it doesn't feel very logical about what you're doing sometimes. Like, you shift the supply curve to the right, and then to find the size of the subsidy, you actually compare vertically. So it's almost like you move horizontally, and then you compare.
It's a really nice way to
vertically.
look at it.
But really, I just realized there was another way to look at it. If you just, it's actually, without even shifting anything, what you could have just done was, if the quantity was 60,000 that you needed to meet in terms of demand, and you look at what the previous supply, to supply 60,000, it would cost $7.
That's right.
And all you would need to do is just subsidize those $4, and that would be another way just to work it out.
That's right. And so I think the way I've always remembered it is the parallel distance between the subsidy and the existing supply, which is essentially what you've just described, right? Like 60,000, parallel difference between the two, $4.
Yeah. And that way you wouldn't even need to move the curve.
Yeah, that's right. You've got it and you're like, great, D, $4, I'm done, more time for my shorts. So now, do you have a final comment here?
Yeah, I just thought 19 and 20 just really highlight the importance of just experimenting, right? I think just from kind of the chatter after that exam, I think a lot of people just kind of guessed it or they didn't really give it a go. And it is important that economics as a subject, right, you don't often feel like you've got to guess anything. Things are usually quite clear cut, right? But for stuff like this, go for it, man. Like, just give it a go, experiment and try different things. Like, obviously don't spend too long on it, but don't be afraid to just give it a go.
And I think particularly when it's a question like that where, you feel it's a really curly one, and you're struggling with it, is even just mark it, come back, finish the rest of the paper, come back in, you'll have a bit of time. Right? There's plenty of time in the paper. So then we're only going to look at one short answer, because most of the short answers were fairly clear. There was one that was probably slightly more funny than anything else, right? Which I know inspired a fair few memes post the HSC exam. And this was in question 23. It was B, why may a public beach not be considered a public good? Great question. Maybe you've seen some of the memes, which is
Maybe you've made a meme.
Possibly, right? Actually, that's probably more likely, right? Yeah. Now, why? I think one of the things that I do find a lot of students get confused about are public goods. Not because they don't know what they are. I think, the idea of, the two components of non-rival, non-excludable are not complex ideas. But I think then we start breaking into pure versus impure, right? And there are these blurry lines
Yes.
sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And so I think where this question was difficult was not in understanding the two criteria for a public good, but in understanding, well, where's the line? It's a little blurry. So, I mean, what would have been a good answer here, essentially?
Well, I think just acknowledging that, yeah, the idea that it's a quasi or an impure public good, first of all, and so it must, in that case, it has to clearly not fully satisfy one of those
Mhm.
conditions. It's got to be either a little bit rivalrous or a little bit excludable,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so in this case, I would have just went with that it is a little bit rival because,
Mhm.
you know,
Go to Manly or Bondi
yeah,
on a busy day?
yeah, or if Rowan's at the beach, you know, I really can't enjoy that. Yeah, what would you?
Well, I think either way, you could say one that, you know, a busy beach, you know, Bondi, Manly. I mean, you don't have to reference a specific beach, but
Yeah.
certainly just that, you know, one person's enjoyment deprives another person or another family of the space to enjoy the water and the beach. You could equally, though, say that it's also excludable in that, you know, like an Ironman's running on a beach, right? Like it's a public event, it's often supported by a council, it's got sponsorship, and then you're excluded from using the beach. So I think in both cases, you know, you as long as you can back up with an example in one way that it's either, you know, actually rival or excludable, you'll pick up the marks. But you just need to be clear about actually backing it up with an example. So, guys, look, hopefully that was useful. You know, we've held ourselves accountable, and I think overall it was, I think, a really great, like if you'd used our predictions, you were good for 5 out of 8 topics, 2 out of 4 shorts, 2 out of 4 essays, right? And I think also, hopefully, if you're waiting for your economic results back and you had some questions that you're uncertain of, hopefully us unpacking these for you has helped you. Maybe it's just freaked you out because you realised you got a bunch of multis wrong. Hopefully not. But particularly for those of you that are doing HSC 2020, hopefully it's giving you some insight into the way in which NESA is approaching the paper and the exam technique that you're going to need. Because really what we were talking about today was the exam technique that you should have as you start going through the paper and, you know, starting to prepare for HSC 2020. So guys, you know, if you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe. You know, Terry and I will be doing a bunch more videos across the course of the year as it comes. You know, global economics is fascinating right now, so we've got loads of things to share. It's going to be a really powerful way for you to stay up to date with what's going on both domestically and globally. Importantly, if you need more support, you know, jump in and get in touch with ArtofSmart. We've got an incredible team of tutors and mentors. Terry and run our classes here at Hornsby campus for ArtofSmart as well. So if you want to learn more, you know, from Terry and myself, get in touch with us. We'd love to support you, and we'll see you next week.